Angel Mataia, and I was born and raised in Southern California. I am located in Apia, Samoa right now, but the route here where I lived before was Utah. So all of the major Polynesian hubs, right? That's where you got Southern California and Utah. So noticing was very much in hindsight, right? Like once I got my diagnosis, then I realized, and I got my diagnosis in my 30s, right? So like, but then I looked back and I was like, wow, that explains a lot of my behavior. But looking at that, um, I grew up with I think my neurodivergency was something that my family just kind of accepted as like, oh, that's just the way Angel is. And a lot of the time I was criticized for that unknowingly. Like, well, they knew it, but I didn't know that it was like it's more than just a personality quirk. So a lot of the times it's like, oh, Angel's not that bright. She's a little slow, right? I move slow. I um, was lazy, or the way I did things didn't make sense. And so I got a lot of criticism for that. And growing up, I just accepted that as factual. Like, yeah, no, I'm not that smart. Like it does take me a while to like get things, right? Or yeah, I am weird. The way I think is weird. Like, because nobody else looks at things that way, right? So I would say something like, okay, let's say we're in Sunday school class, okay, and everybody would have a point, and then I would say something, and everyone's like, "You're weird. That's not at all." Like the rest of us see it like a different way, and then it's like, okay, So like, I just internalize that. I just internalize that as like, okay, yeah, like, yeah, that's what I am. Like, I'm not that smart. I'm lazy. Like, yeah, and so when I got my diagnosis and started breaking that down, like finding that what I thought was a quirk actually has a term for it. Like, for example, laziness is sometimes it's actually executive dysfunction, right? That's a medical term. Um, so to say like, oh, you know, executive dysfunction where it's a challenge where you know what you need to do, but you can't do it. Like you just can't push yourself to do it. That is wild to a someone parent to hear. What do you mean? You can't do it. Like, and so you and your family are pushing through this thing. And so it just becomes, yeah, it's not necessarily a sign that's different. It's you are different and that's weird. And that's just how so and so is. Right. And so it kind of grew from there. But actually realizing it, light bulb in my head, like, oh, I was different. ADHD is the reason I was different. That did not come until my mid 30s when I had a formal diagnosis for sure. It was getting married. For the first time in my life, I had someone in my inner circle who was not part of my family. So for him, living with me, seeing my symptoms firsthand, like that's not normal to him. And it was really curious. Like it was a curiosity to him. Like I'd be cleaning the house, and so the way I clean the house is I'll make a bigger mess, right? So like I put things in piles. I make what seems like a bigger mess, and then I clean up the piles, right? So I sort everything out, and he'll be like, "Oh, that's an interesting technique you have there." You know? What do you mean? And for him to see that, and for me to see myself through his lens, to be like, oh, that's not a thing. Like what my family had accepted because they're in close proximity to me and had summed up to like, well, that's just the way Angel does things, or that's just whatever. Like for somebody now, I have somebody in my inner circle who can see it and be objective about it. Started planting the seeds of like, oh, that's not a thing that everybody does. Not everybody, that's not how everybody deals with this situation. So, really, just having that objective voice and somebody who was curious about why I do the things I do, right? And so, my parents and my family were never curious about it. It was just something I did. They tried to push back against it, and then when they couldn't, or their pushing didn't change the way I did it, they just accepted like, okay, well, that's just how you are. but they were never curious as to like, why do you do things that way? Like, oh,
Oh,
we notice. It's kind of the difference of like noticing with curiosity and then notice and then shaming me, right? So
absolutely.
it's like, why do you do things like that? Don't do things like that. That's weird. Instead of, oh, like, I noticed you do things like that. Why? Is it easier for you to do that? So even just that little shift in recognizing who I am, seeing me, is I think started to make me realize that maybe I needed to look into a diagnosis. Even like the introduction of a new relationship for me was meeting my husband, getting married, and building this life. I was the happiest I ever was, but I found that like my depression was kicking. Well, I didn't know it was depression at the time, but I was really deeply unhappy. And it was really stark because I would check in my head. I would make the checklist of like, okay, am I mad at my partner? No, I love my partner. Okay, is life bad? No, life's not bad. It's actually really good. So the outside, like what was happening in my mind or what was happening in my actual day to day life, wasn't matching to how I felt internally. Like it didn't make sense that I'm the happiest I've ever been. I'm with a partner that I love. Life is so good, but I'm feeling deeply unhappy. Like it wasn't connecting, and that made me realize again that I needed a diagnosis. And I learned later on that intense emotion, whether it's happy, whether it's sad, people with ADHD struggle with emotional regulation, right? So I could be just super excited, but it'll still manifest its way into like a cognitive overload. And I'll have a hard time balancing my emotions and my body will be like, oh, this is weird, we don't like this. And that's how it's reacting. So again, that diagnosis and being able to slow myself down and recognize that my brain is trying to make a connection between how I feel inside versus what's happening, and that connection's not real because there's a temptation to be like, oh, I'm unhappy because then it must be my marriage. It must be whatever. I must have made the wrong choice. That's so dangerous. That's so dangerous. And how many relationships are affected like that? Oh, I must not be happy being a mom. I must not be whatever it is. But really it's just your body has a hard time and a different way of regulating our emotions, and we just need help with that. And that's all it is. I don't think I ever formally like shared my diagnosis. Not like I didn't have like a sit down or a Tylenol with like my family. I just started working it into the day to day. And I think one, I didn't know how else to do that. I didn't know how to have the conversation. And then um also like I don't know how my family would have received it. So I don't know, I just worked it in. One key conversation I remember having with my mom, and I've had this conversation multiple times, was like, after not long after I received my diagnosis and my prescription for my ADHD medication, she was over at my house for breakfast. And I pulled out, my little prescription bottles, and I'm taking my prescription while we're eating breakfast. And she like was like, "What are you? You're taking medicine?" Like she didn't know that I had a new prescription, right? She's like, "What's that for? Are you sick?" Very Polynesian mom. They're like, "Yeah." I was like, "No, it's for my ADHD." And she was like, "What's that?" And I was like, "Oh, and I just used real life examples that she was very familiar with. And I was like, I was like, "Mom, you know how like I'll get really angry really fast when things are too noisy or I'm too sweaty or I'm too like there's just a lot going on." She's like, "Yeah, yeah, yeah, you've always been like that." I was like, "Right. That's a symptom of ADHD." And she was kind of flustered by that. I could tell she was like searching for like what that means. And the way it helped both of us was I was like, "Okay, mom." I was like, "You know how you have gout? Okay." I was like, "You take medicine. Your symptoms flare depending on what's going on around you. Okay. You had too much shellfish. You know you shouldn't have had shellfish. All right. What do? You're gonna take your medicine. Nobody feels weird about that. Okay." Like it's just a thing. It's a thing you have. It's a condition you have. Just like any other physical like illness that we would have. Mom, if I had a fever and I was like taking antibiotics, you wouldn't feel weird about that. And it's the same thing. Like this is a physical reaction that my body is having when things are too whatever they are. Or when I just need help. Like, so to frame it in that way for her as like, yeah, just like anybody else, like, you know, um, very common in our communities, like, oh, your blood pressure's high, oh, you're diabetic, oh, you got to go to, you got to take papa to um dialysis, same thing, and I got to take my ADHD meds. We're all out here, okay? Like, let's don't make it weird. This is not a conversation. It's not a one and done. Like, so don't be mad that, like, because I promise you, my mom does all the time. She forgets because they are used to seeing us like every day. They've watched us grow. They've dealt with our behaviors. So again, it's not something that they see as like a there's something wrong with you. To them, it's just like you've always been that way. What do you mean you need medicine now? Right? Like, and so you're gonna have to have this conversation. And again, I'm just like, look, nobody says anything, mom, when you have your high cholesterol medicine. You don't hear me giving you a hard time. And even if I do, it's this idea like it's a very communal experience. And it's like, yeah, mom, I make sure you eat the food you need to be eating so that you don't have high cholesterol. So for me, or what that looks like for me is when I say I need a break, like I'm just gonna step out. I'm just step out, get some more quiet, and I'll come right back and I'll join the festivities. Okay. But it's that same thing in framing it that way, because one thing our people are really good at, they really are good at communal care, right? They don't realize how to apply it in this, but in my head, it's like, don't stress yourselves out. It's not the way we would communally care for mama and papa in their wheelchair on their walker is the same way we communally care for people with neurodivergency or neurodevelopmental. It's like, oh, what do you need? That's what you need. You need your cane, you need your walker. Again, you need to go dialysis. Okay, shoot, I'll wake up and take you. Okay, baby, you need some headphones? I got you. All right. Like, whatever it is, like we're so good at that. And I think if we just reframed a little, we'd realize like, oh, it's not as wild as we tend to think that it is. So medication, and this goes for, again, a number of physical ailments. The same goes to mental health medication, where it's not like a one size fits all medication, right? Like, and it is normal to be like, oh, I tried this medication, it didn't work. Okay, tell your doctor that, right? Like, don't just write off like a medication because it doesn't work. Or it's part of the process. And then also, you should not rely solely on medication. Medication is a tool, it's not a fix everything, right? So I take medication, but I still need to have healthy coping mechanisms. I still need to get movement, get outside, get sunlight. I still need to talk and communicate with my partner a certain way. I still need to talk about how my needs are met. So it's not a fix all 100%. And it doesn't, just like, again, I keep going back to it because it's so commonsensical for us, but like a physical ailment, okay? Like, it's not just take the medicine and be done, but you probably should, let's say if it's a fever, right? Medicine's not going to take away the fever. What do? We stay warm. We make sure we're hydrated. We get comfortable. We get plenty of rest. There are things that you do in connection with those medications, and in that aspect, that seems completely normal. So just take what you already know and apply that to a mental health medication, and you'll find that it's a lot more commonsensical than it seems. So that would be my advice: is just to know, like, it's a journey. And what works for you, like finding what works for you, is more important than all of the information you'll get, because there's so much out there. But working with trusted professionals to find what works, it could be, some people, it's like, oh, I work out and I take a really low dose of ADHD medication. Or some people, the prescription is higher, but they need a hobby. You're always going to work in conjunction with other coping mechanisms. I think the stigma that mental health medications get is because they are highly addictive, and you'll find that when you go to get your prescription. So for me, I would always have to, I can only get refills up to a certain amount because they're heavily abused, because they're strong, right? They're meant to alter your mental. So if you really do have symptoms, it's going to affect you differently. And because there's a higher chance of abuse, you're going to go through that. But that's also the reason why you need to have external coping mechanisms hand in hand, and therapy and tools to do that. So yeah, it's all good. Like, you'll figure it out. It's okay. When I think about my early introduction into caring for those with neurodevelopmental, and I'm gonna say neurodevelopmental because that was my it's different than I think being neurodiverse. Because so you have like um so I had an uncle who was disabled growing up, and he was obviously cognitively delayed. And actually, fun fact, my mom was adopted by a Tongan family. So I'm Samoan, she's Samoan, but she was adopted by a Tongan family in American Samoa. And I grew up for a long time um, in this Tongan environment. And it was through my Tongan family that I kind of watched how they cared for my uncle with severe neurodevelopmental disability. And it was never something that was like, I don't know, weird. Like he was never like put away, or I never got the feeling that anybody was ashamed. It was just like, oh, Uncle Sini-san needs like, yeah, he needs help going to the bathroom. Oh, okay, somebody go and help him. Like he needs help being fed. Oh, okay. Like, and so just dealing with physical differences, cognitive delays, I never got the fact that it was like something to be shamed. It just felt like, oh, we just help them just like we would anything else. Um, but I think I realized growing up earlier that there are certain, like, for depression, for ADHD, I think it's a little harder for us as Pacific people to put in that same that same space, because it doesn't manifest physically. We can understand a physical ailment. We can understand and help a physical disability. We feel compassion for that. What is really hard for us to understand, and I think because it's not visible, is mental illness and mental health. Um, and it wasn't until until I got older and I realized um, how severe mental health issues, how severely they affect and impact our Pacifika communities. We've talked about the high statistics of, and I'll say Samoans because those are the statistics that resonated with me. But Samoans have a high percentage of suicide among youth, particularly male between 14 and 35, right? Um, and um, that really made me wonder, like, what is happening? Like, what's happening in our families? What's happening with this culturally, that the data is showing what it is. The Pacific Health Model, the Fono Fale, Samoan Fale Pillars of Health, right? So it just talks about like all of these different like pillars. When you talk about a Samoan Fale, like how it's constructed. And so there's physical, spiritual, mental, other, and then all of this around culture and family. Right. And so I think that the idea that mental health, at least in 2026, the idea that mental health is a stigmatized topic when we have Pacifika modeled like um, ways to approach treatment in mental health, I think is incorrect, right? Like it shouldn't be stigmatized, because if it was, why would we have Pacifika models that help us to address this in a cultural background? Um, and sharing things like this with our family to be like, you see, there's a someone doctor who is someone who is addressing like the different contexts of mental health and health in general. Like he pairs all of this. It speaks to the fact that we are in a time and age where we just have access to so much information. And it speaks to the resiliency of our people, and it speaks to the experiences of our people, that there is a doctor, like that there are professionals, Pacifica professionals, who are trying to frame this in the context of our culture. And that is that is the lens that's how we walk through the world. That's how our parents see the world, is through the context of culture. And so it's not that, mental health is not, um, it's not a part of our culture. We can look at that. We can look at mental health through the same lens. They're not separate. Like, how else are we supposed to look at the world, right? We only know how to walk through it a certain way, and
Yeah.
it's okay to look at mental health in the same context. Like, I'm Polynesian. I'm Samoan. Like, why wouldn't I look at mental health through a Samoan lens. Like that's how I see the world. And it's not a separate thing, you know. I think culture has made it difficult, but I think it's because the things that we think are cultural are not in fact cultural. I think I have learned that through the lens of like it took me moving to Samoa to realize that a lot of the things that I thought were cultural are not. They're just actually bad habits that we've adopted in our families. Like we are not like if you look at anciently, like some of um the practices that we have. So in Samoa, you have like really public, really out in the open exercise. So ifonga, when you talk about ifonga, it's like a public way that you ask for forgiveness. It's just everybody's involved, and it's hard. It's a difficult process. So if you ever and someone's out there, look it up if you're not familiar with it. But the point of that is that we are people that talk about difficult things out in the open. That is a communal, like, which again, why wouldn't we? Because we're communal people, right? So when and where this shift happened that we can't talk about certain things, like, is unique to me. And I think that as I wrap my head around that, um, I was able to say, oh, okay, like foundationally, it's not. It's we're not a sweep it under the rug, sweep it under the falla kind of people. And I think sometimes growing up in our Western experience, I think sometimes we think that. Um, but learning learning how to approach that topic in a way that um, makes sense for us is really important because and it goes back to what I was talking about. I didn't have like a formal sit down. I tried my best to make connections that make sense to my family because I know that one thing, at least for some ones, and I think probably for Tongans too, where it's like there's a way that you say things. We're very much like protocol, very like uh how you approach things. I don't know. You want to say sensitive, but like in Samoan, there is a high chiefly language, and then there's just your everyday conversational, right? And so I think that like there's a polite way to say things, and then there's an impolite way to say things. And so for Samoans, at least, we are very cognizant of how things are communicated. And so just because you have something difficult doesn't mean that you don't need to put in the work to find like, okay, how do I communicate this in a healthy way, in a way that's not going to make my family feel weird? Um, and that in of itself is a whole conversation because maintaining relationships, going to therapy, clear communication, those are all a byproduct of understanding your diagnosis and understanding how you process information. And so I don't think that you have to, as soon as you get to your diagnosis, like call the family. We need to have a phono. Everybody sit down. I think process it yourself. Learn yourself first, and then let's go ahead and introduce the family because it can be a lot to try to balance that culturally. So yeah, as far as culture and family, um, I think uh, yeah, I like I said before, we look at the world through the lens of our family and through the lens of our culture, and making sure that that lens is clear is really important. Separating, okay, this is my own behavior. This is a lack on my own part. I can't regulate my emotions. It's not because I'm Samoan, it's because I have ADHD. Like, like, right? And where you have this idea of like, oh yeah, like someone say bad tempers. It's like, no, no, we don't. We just we just don't know how to regulate. We just don't go to therapy. You know what I'm saying? Like one thing I've learned in going to therapy is all of my anger, all of my bitterness, all of my resentment, whatever negative things that I have that I need to get off my chest, that's for therapy, right? That's for therapy. Like, and they're going to give me the verbiage, they're going to give me the tools I need to take that and talk to my mama in a respectful way, in a way that she understands, in a way that we are going to meet each other where we need to meet each other, right? Because otherwise we're just going to fight. Otherwise we're just going to fight. So I and I don't want that. And I think that's what sometimes we struggle with as a people is like, well, every time I bring it up, every time I talk about my hurt, my family reacts in a certain way, and it's hard to hear that, like, well, yeah, because you need to process that, in therapy with somebody who's objective, with somebody who can give you the tools. Because all of us in our families, like, guess who else hasn't been to therapy? Your mom. You know what I mean? Like, so to have these conversations when we are both like, when neither of us have the tools, like, of course we're gonna clash. Of course, it sounds counterintuitive to the conversation that we've had so far, but I'm just gonna go out and I'm me myself. Like, I had to accept my diagnosis. Sorry, my stuff is just flying all over the place. I had to book the appointment myself. I had to make the decision myself to go and ask about it. I had to take myself to therapy. I had to I had to have the hard conversations myself. And so a lot of that I had to build the self-acceptance. Like, I can't stigmatize myself. However, like, everybody else can act however they're going to act. I don't have any control about that. But and they might feel bad about me. I might make them feel whatever, but I can't feel that about myself. Like, like, because if I don't have my own back, like, who else is going to? And I don't mean that in the like me against the world type of being in a place of like, you know what? I don't want to I need to understand myself better, and I deserve to um figure that out and to have a happy life. And one of the most difficult conversations that I have ever had to have, and this is an important part, I think, for neurodivergency, because I think ADHD gets misunderstood in that, like, oh, I just can't pay attention. And a lot of mental health issues are, I forget what's the word. Oh, like there's comorbidity is what it is. And so comorbidity is that a lot of the time it is paired with other health issues, right? So it's you don't just have ADHD. It's paired quite often with depression. It's paired with like a lot of other things, bipolar disease, autism, right? So there's a lot of comorbidities, and it could be a mental health issue, and sometimes it's even like it can manifest in higher blood pressure. So physical, it's comorbidity because it's a co with something else. So for me, it's with depression and anxiety. That those are my comorbidities with ADHD. And one of the issues I struggled with was when I moved to Samoa, the availability of my ADHD medication. It was hard to come by. Um, Living on an island, a lot of things are hard to come by, but my ADHD medication was one of them, and I suffered immensely. And I've struggled throughout my life with suicidal ideation. I learned that through my diagnosis of ADHD that, again, it's like, yeah, it makes sense. Because they go hand in hand, right? And so I've had to have a really damn, I didn't get any tissues. That's fine. I've had to have really difficult conversations with my partner at my lowest times, especially when I didn't have access to my medications, where I've I've had to tell him, like, listen, if anything happens to me, I if I go for a walk one day and I don't come back, whatever it is, if something ever happens to me, I need you to understand that it's not because I have an unhappy life. It's not because I don't love you. It's not because I didn't think of you, right? It's because I was tired. I was tired. And I parallel this as I have through this whole conversation with this idea of like, if somebody if somebody had cancer, okay, cancer is a very intense sickness. Treatment is very intense, okay? And there comes to a point where the body can only take so much and they get tired. And a lot of the time that tiredness is where the treatment, like, your body just can't do it anymore, right? And a lot of the time people will see that journey in somebody with an illness like that and say, like, yeah, oh, they're tired. It's so good that they can rest. There's no more suffering, right? Nobody would ever look at that and say, like, I stigmatize that process. And I had to have this conversation with my partner, and I was like, I know if anything ever happened to me, I know that there's a lot. that would come up, right? But I need you to understand that none of that is true. That if I ever, God forbid, if I ever get to a point where I leave you, like, it is very much a product, it's a symptom of an illness that I had. Just like if I had passed away from cancer, if I had passed away from any other physical ailment, like it's the same because I was like, it gets to a point, and at the time that we have had these conversations, for whatever reason, it just got so much to bear. And mental illness, the reason why it's an illness is because your brain is telling you things that are just not rational. They're not, you know. And anybody who doesn't have that would not be able to wrap their head around it. They'd be like, what do you mean you don't feel loved? What do you mean you're not needed? What do you mean? You know, and like my husband has had to have those conversations with me. And so I think it's important when we're talking about ADHD, we're not just talking about like, oh, I have a hard time paying attention sometimes, right? It comes, there are layers. Yeah, there are layers to it. And you can't understand and diagnose those, like one leads to the other, right? And so to make, that's why it's important um, to be open and to not brush off what seems like a quirk. If you look at the whole of your life, and a lot of our, as the statistics show, a lot of our people in our community suffer with suicidal ideation without even knowing that it's a comorbidity of something like ADHD, right? And so, yeah, that's why it's important. Go see your doctor. Yeah.
I think it's also important to just clarify for anybody watching, depression and anxiety, because it's the morbidity. Those depression is an illness. That is certain things in your brain and in your regulatory system, like your chemicals are not up to par with where they should be. Yes. ADHD is not a mental illness. It's just a way that your brain is already
right. 100%. It's a neurodivergent, so different way of processing. Absolutely, 100%. Thanks for that clarification. Because and alone, ADHD, I feel like if I always say to myself, if I could separate out, if I could choose, right? If I had to choose between ADHD and depression, ADHD all day. You know, like yeah, I just need a timer and a list. That's all. You know, it's the pairing with depression that gets me into those places that are very hard to get out of. And I am on, and if anybody needed, like, I guess, evidence, it's like the medication that I have treats all three of those separately, right? So I have a medication for ADHD, I have a medication for depression, I have a medication for anxiety, right? And that should go to show that they are three very different things. Otherwise, you just, pop one and done. But no, you're absolutely right. It's they're separate and they work together, but not always. So yeah. Remember, like, as we gain information about mental health, like, we can build community like in different ways. But there are actually a lot of organizations here in Samoa that are dealing with these same conversations. So it kind of goes back to the example that I showed, where like in the motherland, we're talking about it. So surely we can talk about it at family home evening or whatever, like during this meet and greet, this Talanoa session, a young person asked one of the leaders on the panel, and they said, hey, look, I'm having a really hard time in my village. People are giving me a hard time. They treat me differently. I am different. I don't know where to go for support. I don't know where to go for support in my village. And the panelist said to this young someone, find a new village. That's what you do. Like, and that was amazing to me. And not to be like, oh, go no contact and dump your, no. And I don't think we, but it's this idea of like, I can find understanding. I can find a village who understands what I'm going through online. I can make a group. If there is no group for Polynesian parents of, children who are neurodivergent, or Polynesian parents of children who are autistic, make a Facebook group. I know that. You know what I mean? Like,
Absolutely.
build you there. We can make a village. You can find